I watched the first 3 episodes of The Dropout on Hulu. It is about Elizabeth Holmes, the founder of Theranos, which was a big fraud, a scam, that reached a $9 billion valuation on around $400 million of investments. She was hailed as the first self-made female billionaire, got tons of positive news coverage and stuff, before it came out that her medical product never worked, that they had been faking results, faking lab tests, faking demos, faking lots of things. The TV show is way overly sympathetic to the criminal who hurt a lot of people and destroyed a lot of wealth, including one of her major science people committed suicide, apparently related to the stress of the company and her fraud and various factors. I'm not saying she directly did anything to that individual, just that the overall environment she created was really nasty, and from what I read briefly, he was going to be called to testify about what happened there, and he didn't want to say things to harm the company and the medical technology, because all these people thought it was an aspirational company that was trying to improve the world and stuff, so they didn't want to hurt it. They were working there because they were true believers, primarily. So he was under this pressure not to say things that were bad for it, but on the other hand, he didn't want to lie when testifying, and he killed himself instead of deal with the conflict. So that seems to be somewhat on her, one of the downstream consequences of her fraud. Other downstream consequences, it's not just her investors who lost money, and it's not just her employees who got a bad deal. It is also the patients. She did trials with Pfizer using a device she knew did not work. So she wasted the effort of the patients. And it's worse than just wasting their time and effort on something that won't work. So having a clinical trial to test if it works is a waste of time. It's worse than that, because if you think it's working and you get results, doctors make medical decisions based on those results. The blood test says they have this or don't have this, and then medical decisions get made and they get worse care. So it probably killed some people that way too. There are stories like someone got a bunch of blood test results from Theranos, and their doctor looked at it and said, "Hey, this looks really dangerous. You might have a stroke. You better go to the emergency room." So they went to the emergency room and they got tests, and it turned out they were completely fine and all their tests came back normal. The thing is, going to the emergency room can be really expensive, and also thinking that you have a major health problem for a couple days before you get more tests can be really bad. That's scary. It produces a lot of anxiety. Sometimes people kill themselves during the few days before they find out everything's actually okay. I've heard stories of people killing themselves because they thought they lost a lot of money, but they would have found out if they just waited a few days that it was okay. There was one about some investor who did some sort of complicated financial hedging strategy, and he thought he did it right, and he tried to talk to, I think it was Robinhood, but I'm not sure, because his account statement showed that he had lost 100 grand or whatever. And he's like, "How is that possible? I thought this was hedged." And he couldn't get any answers. And he killed himself, and it was just basically a display error on his account. He had not lost the money, and it got fixed a few days later. But the customer support was completely useless, and he didn't really fully understand what he'd done and wasn't fully confident and panicked. And so if you freak people out and give them misinformation, some of them will just die. Milder things happen too. There's a lot of cases where they're just under all that stress, they quit their job or make some sort of bad decision, sign up for some sort of course that's supposed to help that doesn't help, and waste a couple $1,000s on it. Like, all kinds of decisions can get made when they're under a lot of stress. It leads to some divorces, like they just lean on their spouse more and their spouse gets fed up with it. And it pushes things over the brink. It's never the entire cause all by itself, but it can be a contributing factor. So I think she hurt people, and it's a big deal. And it wasn't just the investors who bet money on her, some of whom, I think, did not do their due diligence, and I don't have full sympathy for them. I don't think they were just purely conned. Like, yes, she lied to them, but it was partly their job to look into what they were investing in. So it's more of a mixed scenario where she was bad, but they were somewhat bad too. But pretty much everyone else she hurt, it's just entirely on her. Not entirely. So Pfizer or Walgreens or various companies that she had a partnership with done a lot of better due diligence. She got over $100 million deal with Walgreens. I think it was Walgreens. And I think she had a big deal with Safeway. And so those companies should have looked into Theranos much, much more. Don't know what the hell they were doing. Anyway, the story is interesting in various ways. One is how hard it is to fix things, to whistleblow. Lots of people had concerns. Theranos was aggressive. It threatened people if they talked. It made them sign confidentiality agreements when they joined or left the company. It hired private investigators and stalked people, tracked them, used spyware on company computers, I think. So they segregated divisions in the company and put a lot of information on a need-to-know basis and limited access and said security and confidentiality and stuff. And they were doing all these sort of suspicious things, like why do they need all this? Why can't the information be more open? And part of the big picture is they said our medical technology is proprietary, it's confidential, it is a trade secret, so we won't explain it to you. And why was that acceptable to anyone? Like, you can keep some of the details secret, but what was the basic innovation? How did it work? Give me the general category of what you're doing. How are you doing better than other people? You have to give some sort of story about what you're doing and why it works and why it's good. If you give no story whatsoever and you just say, trust me, the secrets are confidential, but it works, why would I trust you? Why should I believe you? And there are a lot of reasons to be skeptical. Because a lot of what they're claiming to do was very hard or impossible, given our current understanding of the science. And they didn't explain how they had made like some sort of major breakthrough. They didn't address that in any way, as far as I can tell. And also, the trade secret excuse doesn't work that well when a lot of what you're doing has been published in academic journals and is in some textbooks. Like, they were doing some sort of microfluidics stuff. There was literature about that already. Other people had already worked on it. Sometimes they gave some answers like that they were using the same basic chemistry as existing tests rather than inventing new chemistry. I mentioned that they had apparently said that somewhere, in some manner. It's like, okay, if you're using the same chemistry, why can you do it with 1% as much blood, or some significantly smaller amount of blood than the other tests? Are you saying that they were just inefficient by a factor of 100 for no particular reason? Why were their machines so big and clumsy and whatever? Was the industry just waiting for anyone to make the effort to make it better? They gave some very vague answers, like that they were using computers and software and computation to make things more efficient, but no like real answers that should convince anyone. So I've seen a few stories about who they did convince and how and why. The show so far has focused on convincing Don something. I forgot his last name. He wears a cowboy hat, and he was apparently from Oracle, knows Larry Ellison, and was a venture capitalist, and she got him on board without giving him much detail. A lot of what she emphasizes is, if it works, how great would it be? And she also says things like she wants to be a billionaire or an inventor. She started with a goal, be a billionaire or be an inventor, rather than starting with knowledge of the medical field, problems in the field. She didn't work in the field for a while, see what was going on, see what the problems were, and consider how to make an incremental improvement to something. She just came along with pie-in-the-sky ideas and then tried to talk people into giving her a lot of money, and then they did. So pretty much her whole board of directors, apparently, was due to one contact she made. She got a 10-minute appointment with George Shultz, who had high positions in government repeatedly. And he was old, like 80 or something. And the 10-minute appointment lasted 2.5 hours. She apparently charmed him, inspired him, said a lot of stuff that sounded good to him about how she wanted to change the world and how great this medical device would be. And he liked the idea. It sounded nice to him the way she presented it. So she had a good pitch, and she got this one person on board. And then pretty much her whole board of directors, all the prestigious names that she had attached to the company, and there were a bunch of them that impressed people, but they all came from the one contact. He liked it, and then he got his friends to join in. So she basically convinced one person, and then all his second-handed friends just believed him and joined in the thing he was doing. And then this guy, it is the same person who comes up in a second story. So there were a couple whistleblowers in the company who played a role in its demise. It ended up going down after a Wall Street Journal article that accused it of fraud and had talked to a bunch of people and said there were various allegations and raised questions in public, and that really started the ball rolling on the company falling apart. And one of the people involved in that was George Shultz's grandson. And the grandson, along with another woman who had worked there, Erica Chung, I think is the name. I forgot the grandson's name. Let me look it up. Okay, it was Tyler Shultz. So Tyler Shultz and Erica, Tyler and Erica, are both like early 20s. Theranos is their first job, and they notice things are wrong there, and that there's fraud going on. And they go talk to George Shultz, because Tyler is his grandson, so he can go talk to him. And George Shultz is an investor, he's on the board of directors, and he's gotten a bunch of his friends involved. So he cares, and Tyler and Erica go talk to him, and Tyler says they're taking blood samples, and as soon as the people who give the blood leave the room, they run them into a different room and split them up, and then put them into conventional machines instead of using their Theranos machine. Like the thing they're supposedly inventing, this testing machine, they're not using it. They're switching the machines and just using regular machines to get results. And so it's just fraud. And George Shultz, the old guy, said, a lot of people say this is great, it's going to change the world, so I'm just going to stick with it, because smart people think it's good. Something like that. That's roughly the idea. This is the story Tyler has been telling in public. It's not coming from George. And so even with your own family member telling you, like, he's personally observed this fraud going on, people just will still turn a blind eye to it. That's what a lot of the very high social climber people are like, who have gotten into places of power. They're very focused on what do people think, and they don't care about the facts of reality. Just like we see in Atlas Shrugged, when the rulers just, all they care about is ordering people around, motivating them, scaring them, having power over them, etc. And they figure the details about physical reality will work themselves out. You just order people to fix it, and then someone deals with it, and you don't have to worry about physical reality. That comes up repeatedly in Atlas Shrugged. And then physical reality starts getting out of control, like when he can't get grapefruits. And he's, but my doctor said I need grapefruits, and the train doesn't work anymore, sorry. You can't just order people to make it work. That doesn't fix train tracks and bridges. But a lot of people at the top are very insulated or isolated from the problems of physical reality, and society would have to break down quite a bit for them personally to be very affected by physical reality issues. The vast majority of people who have less wealth are going to be affected first. They have a huge buffer. And that in socialism, too, where they destroy the country, but the elite rulers have wine and caviar. They're fine, at least for a while. They can have a nice lifestyle in physical, material terms, even while they're starving millions of people to death. They're not the ones who physically suffer first. So they're very separated from the actual physical results of their policies. Speaking of which, Russia is currently invading Ukraine, and previously Russia genocided Ukraine in the Holodomor, the potato famine, where Russia was actually shipping large amounts of food out of Ukraine to eat in Russia while the Ukrainians were starving, and they put armed guards on farm fields to not let the farmers eat their own food. And so that is why Ukraine is fighting back really hard and not just rolling over and letting Russia conquer them. They're willing to fight to not be ruled by those people again. Not that it's the only reason, but it's pretty important. If these people have killed millions of you before, then you're going to be a lot more willing to risk your life to fight them, rather than to be like, who really cares who the king is? Not king, it's dictator. I don't know what Putin's title is, president. Doesn't matter. He is a dictator. A lot of investors in Silicon Valley and elsewhere say out loud, explicitly, to the public, repeatedly, that they are pretty focused on investing in people, not ideas. They want to find a smart, ambitious person and invest money in them. And the idea, the business concept is not so important. The business can be pivoted. They can, if it's not working, they can just change and do something else. They want someone who will encounter roadblocks and get past them. So their concern is not, will this idea run into roadblocks? They assume that all the ideas will run into major problems, obstacles, blockers. Is this the kind of person who is going to get past obstacles or not, is their concern. So Elizabeth Holmes had to convince investors that she was smart, that she was a go-getter, stuff like that, and that she was ambitious and would keep trying. And then they weren't so worried about, does the science actually make any sense? You just hire some scientists and tell them to work it out. Everyone seemed to be okay with that. The whole thing is part of our culture of not using decisive arguments to actually come to rational conclusions about issues. Instead, a lot of people just use their judgment and their intuition for no good reasons, with no clear reasoning and arguments that would reach an objective conclusion. And so they get lots of things wrong. And the difficulty with whistleblowing or addressing the fraud is related to paths forward. If there were ways for people who have concerns and objections to get actual answers and get it discussed to some sort of objective, rational conclusion, then a fraud like this could never happen. Because people's initial questions, instead of getting shut down and then getting scared into silence and isolated and so on, they'd be able to publicly raise their concerns and have reasonable discussions about it, and then actually expect, demand answers and rebuttals and counter-arguments. And then if everything actually got sorted out in a truth-seeking way, frauds are going to lose the debate. There are other companies where it's more borderline, it's harder to tell, and something that's not a great idea might sometimes win a debate, but the outright frauds are going to lose with pretty much 100% reliability in an actual open truth-seeking debate. So I think it's important to look at it not just this one lady was a con artist, or her and a few friends were bad people and tricked other people. I think you can look at, how did society allow this? Why are people impressed with these high status names who are on her board of directors? why are the high status people getting on board with a fraud without doing due diligence? Why are they putting their name behind things when they don't really know what they're talking about? And if they're that kind of person, why does anyone respect their name and say, oh, their name's on it, it must be good? Except they just put their name on stuff because other influential people have their name on it. That's what most of them do. They just follow along the others are doing, and then a few of them sometimes take the lead, but often with no idea what they're doing. Just because they're more bold or risky or whatever. So the power structures are really screwed up. And by the way, Theranos, her father, had a bunch of government posts and had contacts in the government world and was a high-status individual with a good Rolodex himself. And she managed to raise like $6 million from friends and family and stuff before getting venture capital. Because she came from a place of wealth and privilege and prestige and contacts and stuff. And she went to Stanford for a bit, an elite university where you meet elite people, high social status people, and can build up contacts. And she got a professor to help her there. And so it's not just anyone with an idea can do this kind of thing. To a large extent, it is only the privileged people from the right social background get these kinds of opportunities. And I think what it says about Safeway and Walgreens, that they could sign $100 million deals with this fraud company without ever really looking into it, is really bad. Another similar example is Nikola is a fraud. They make like electric trucks or something. There's a long article with investigative journalism about what was wrong with them and how they've been lying about things and so on. And nevertheless, they have some sort of partnership with General Motors, and they didn't just completely dissolve when the article came out, and it's screwed up. A lot of people are very suspicious of inferring a lot about the world from a small amount of data, from one or two examples. They want to have lots of data and a small amount of analysis. I think that's backwards. It works a lot better to have a little bit of data and a lot of analysis. And you do want to look around at the world and have a decent amount of data just to check that none of it contradicts what you're saying. You do want to look around for counterexamples. But the important thing is to have a lot of analysis, to put serious thought into what the data means rather than how much data you have. Having more data is generally a good thing that can be somewhat helpful. If more examples about frauds and social climbing and whatever, it's easier to see patterns. But you can take just a little bit of data and think about it carefully and be like, this shows that giant megacorps like Walgreens are irresponsible with $100 million and are irresponsible with business partnerships and are irresponsible with medical safety for the people who go in and get tests there. That they don't actually have good due diligence in place for those things, that they could do a deal with Theranos without actually sending a team in to walk around the building and check how everything is being done and see the details enough to satisfy themselves that it works and it's reasonable and so on. So one thing that you can infer from that is that if you have a product that's really good, that doesn't mean that you will get big business deals. It doesn't mean you'll get investors, etc., because the processes they use to make decisions apparently do not do a good job of checking whether the product is real and good and stuff. So I think that means if you have a product that's actually good, that they're not going to really know the difference between that and Theranos. So it won't provide you as much advantage as it should. A lot of people assume we live in a world with a lot more competence than I think there actually is. A lot more smart people who are actually smart and good at things and stuff like that. And then you can look at these examples and they're just like, oh, a few people were a fraud. But I think it shows a lot about the world. Like, why was the fraud not detected sooner? I think that shows that all these people are interacting in ways where they can't tell if you're actually smart or not. So why do you think all the other people are actually smart? A lot of them are not so dishonest, they're not so fraudulent, but that doesn't mean they're actually really good at things. I think a lot of people are just mediocre at stuff, even people in high positions.